I'm not very aware. Is it that if you accept the invitation, it becomes entry becomes independent of my admission? Can you get the point? That means if you accept the invitation, then you can enter anytime. Is it the process? No
Yes,
response.
sir.
Huh? So that's the
Yes,
good.
sir. So you have to admit only one.
No, my point is, I mean, if you don't accept formally the invitation, then you need my permission to admit, to enter into the meeting. Is it? Anyway, you also don't know most well. Okay, now I must start because around 30 students. So what will be? But once I go into the presentation, then it will be difficult to admit people. So it's around 5 minutes plus, maybe another 1 or 2 minutes. Still, people are joining. So I'm thankful to the student, forgot his name, who has made this attendance sheet. Devashish Nomdi most probably. Anyway, So now let's start. Okay, I have around 35 students. So if I go to the presentation mode, so is it visible? Oh, somebody is still entering. Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
So I may not go to the presentation mode just because it will be better because then I can admit the people also as they go on coming. So now, I mean, in last class we have just tried to define the what is the I mean how the energy different types of energies are classified in the energy conservation perspective. Means energy conservation perspective is not a scientific basis. Better to say it's more related to the practical, commercial, and practically feasible aspects. From that viewpoint, actually, energy conservation is considered to be, I mean, it considered the people will go on coming, but I cannot allow for the whole class. Okay, so then we have classified the energy into three different ways. One is basically on the basis of the so-called primary secondary energy with the intention of finding out which one is easily available and which one needs some intervention with respect to cost, effort, etc., etc. And also any technological intervention, then there will be some environmental impact also. Second way of classification was on the basis of the so-called commercial, non-commercial, which is purely on the basis of commercial aspect, because that's undoubtedly a very important issue with respect to the energy conservation, because it's a practical industrial subject. And third one is uh, the general aspect with respect to the future sustainability, which I will discuss a little bit today. That's the renewable and non-renewable, because non-renewable concept is these are exhaustible and these will be exhausted after a certain time. So obviously we have to replace all the non-renewable energy options to renewable energy options in course of time. It may be some of the areas are priority, some of the areas may be less priority, because say oil based system transportation mostly has to be switched over to renewable energy systems at first, not that other electricity supply, because coal reserves are much more in this earth than the oil reserve. I will come to that part also most probably today. How is the reserve scenario of the different fossil fuels, because I mean, the non-availability of fossil fuels has prompted more towards the directions of the energy conservation activated globally. Now, coming to the part of the comprehensive planning and actions of energy conservation perspective, as I have mentioned that in 1973 there was a war between the Arab and the Israel countries, which is called the Ramadan War, and this has originated in 1973 around. People realized that the how much the supply of oil, if these are artificially created, that particular problem, I mean artificially if some problem can be created in the supply chain, not supplying the oil to the to specific countries, because this war actually, during this war, the Arab countries has put restrictions on the European those European countries who have supported Israel. So this crisis or immediate problem the European those European countries faced was not due to the non-availability of energy resources, but it's a purely political decision. And in fact, from there the energy conservation originated. So the concept of expediting energy conservation originated not from any technological background, but from a purely political background of the Ramadan war between the Arab countries and the Israel. Now, later on, there is another interesting development. You know that over the years, the different people have started, thinking in different way of managing the energy resources, etc. and it has added up to different new dimensions also. And what happened actually, over the years, people have started thinking that we have a significant improvement in living standard, and people have undoubtedly has grown over the period from their, I mean, traditional so-called savage, not savage, that primitive life to the modern technologically developed better living standard. And simultaneously, people are worried about whether this is possible to maintain. And to explore this, the United Nations has appointed, rather had appointed a committee which was led by one lady from Norway, because Norway is considered to be one of the very much environment friendly and overall happiness index priority country. Anyway, those issues I'm not going into that, because I had another course actually I teach in mechanical, that's for sustainable engineering. That's interesting, where the not necessarily the resource and your technological development will make you better, happy, or better sustainable. These are different issues. But anyway, when that was introduced into the, I mean, that was the committee was formed to explore what should be the future projections of humanity as a whole globally. Then the definitions of that, our common future, defined in 1987 by the European Union's commissions, sorry, United Nations commissions. I'm sorry, United Nations commissions led by Brundtland, was came under the report which is called Our Common Future. Interestingly, by this Our Common Future, the interesting part is what has been defined is, though we are politically separated, we are physically connected by a single earth. So, you know that the interesting part is, slowly the missions are coming up. I mean, philosophically, there were many people, including our poet Rabindranath Tagore, who has promoted that particular concept of the global humanity. But interestingly, those things are coming up through scientific facts that we will be compelled to come to that concept for the benefit of all. For example, this why this name was made as our common future is that this common future is not to any particular country or any particular race. This is with respect to the global concept. So in 1987, under that particular report, Our Common Future, you can explore in the internet the entire full report, those who are interested, because it's for public dissemination and public awareness, and it's a documentations of the United Nations future projection of best pathway for future development. And then how it was defined was that sustainable development is the term. In fact, sustainability, sustainable energy, all this came from the original definition of sustainable development. And sustainable development has been defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. Interestingly, this definition, and if you go through Our Common Future, there are some preamble analyzing the practical constraints of doing these things, and also what are the, I mean, difference at different locations of the globe, the, I mean, the so-called with respect to available facilities, living standard, etc., has been described in detail. Then, based on the present current context, what should be the future projection that has been defined in this report, Our Common Future? And there you will find out that the definitions of this particular sustainable development seems to be, I mean, very straightforward sentence. We are going to meet the present generations, whatever is the living standard, etc., without compromising the future generation need. In fact, the future generation need was not that much explicit previously in any of the concepts, because we are thinking about protecting ourselves, we are thinking about environmental protections, but when the future generation's own need has to be protected, that concept came into the so-called sustainable development concept in the report of the Brundtland Commission. Then the resource efficiency and the resource conservation and the resource utilization has become a very important aspect. For example, we breathe every day, we get our oxygen for our living, we don't care for it, we assume that it's quite, I mean, we will have it for entire, I mean, any time of our, not only our life, but the future generations' life. Sun gives the sunlight and the, I mean, heat every day in the morning, and we assume that we will have it. Interestingly, some of these are beyond our control whether they are available or not, but we are jeopardizing these naturally available resources. One of the most important is related to energy, which is the fossil fuel based system. Because fossil fuel reserves, they are not indefinite, they are non renewable, means they have a certain reserve capacity. If depending on how much you are extracting those fossil fuels from below the ground and how you are consuming based on that rate, the complete depletions of those fossil fuels will depend. So you must have, for the specifically for the limited resources, you have to be careful. Similarly, air, oxygen in air seems to be virtually unlimited, but interestingly, with increase of air pollution, this availability of oxygen becomes restricted with respect to the breathing purpose. These are very trivial, but honestly speaking, these are not trivial when you go for the international perspective or global perspective. So, based on these, what happened? Now, what to do? Interestingly, the sustainable development is a concept which is very easy and straightforward, but implementing sustainable development is not that easy. And there is a lot of debate. If you are in this particular area of research, you will find out what is sustainable development path. That means what should be the actions of the sustainable development. That's not that easy, because we who actually work in this particular area, we always have to think that though the overall international goal with respect to sustainable development is clearly defined, but there are many local constraints. For example, what is the sustainable development path actions for the advanced country of an Europe or US cannot be the same way of, I mean, the same way of doing things in a poor country in Africa. So we call it, there are global goal with local context. Interestingly, with respect to this global goal and local context, the path of sustainable development is not that very easy to determine for a particular country or a particular location. Even the action points goes on changing with respect to the location of different parts of a country. For example, in India also, we have several locations where the agricultural product, I mean, are everything are pretty good. Some in some places there are the good, I mean, mining and ores, or a lot of mining and ore rich locations are there, but some areas are neither agricultural product nor any other natural resources. So the sustainable development path for every location may not be same, though the objective goal is same. That's why what has happened, then how to do. If required, I will give a text later on, but I think if you can understand this particular slide, then you can make of your own also. Now, United Nations 17 SDGs means these are sustainable development goals. What happened when the sustainable development term has been defined? Then the question came in United Nations. We have made a philosophical statement. What to do? So obviously, what to do means unless you can classify this overall concept into small sub concepts or other sub goals, then your action paths is not very defined. Even after defining the sub goals, then also the under each sub goal you have to have different defined actions. But if you can classify into different sub goals or sub objectives, then obviously it will be easier rather than implementing the overall concept as a whole. So what the United Nations has done later on, they have defined, classified this sustainable development with some 17 different goals. And these 17 different goals are called sustainable development goals. We call it SDGs. What is there is, you can go on making debates, and still the debates are going on. But still, when you have to move with the objective, everything may not be settled just in one single sitting or other one single decision or conclusion. And emerging things always goes on changing. But international community at present till date has accepted it may change in future also. It doesn't matter that there are 17 distinct goals or the sub-classified objective of the sustainable development, under which the number one goal is no poverty. Means if there is poverty existing in a particular location of the world, then obviously it cannot make the process to be sustainable development for the future generation. So you have to remove it as far as possible. Goal number two is zero hunger. Somebody can argue that this no poverty and zero hunger, they are interconnected. Interestingly, this also not necessarily always be connected. There are certain economic theory where poverty and hunger, though they are grossly connected, but there are some other socio-political reasons which can make a discrimination within the people. So that's why the no poverty and zero hunger, these have been defined as two separate goals. Goal number three is good health and well-being. Obviously, it does not need any explanation because this should be one of the important aspects of the better living. Then goal number four, quality education. That is a part of the overall growth of the system, because unless if you have a quality education, obviously all of you know that your society cannot go to the next step. Then goal number five is gender equality, which is very much important. Though this gender equality is not that prominent, inequality is not that prominent in some of the countries, but at least globally, still we have distinct gender inequality, which has to be made an objective for the, lesser or rather no gender inequality should be there in future for that sustainable development. Clean water and sanitation, this is obviously very important and it does not need any explanation. And then after this explaining a little bit about these goals, I will come up to why these classifications are more important from the policy planning also. Number 7 is affordable and clean energy. In fact, our energy conservation comes under this goal. Now you can have a feeling that once you read a subject, if it has certain relation with respect to sustainable development goals, then to find out under which category it comes under, then the government policy, funding, etc. are also related to that. For example, whenever we write a project, for international collaboration, we have to generally define if it has certain sustainability aspect, under which goal does it come. And interestingly, if you can fit your project proposal into one of these goals, there is always a very high prospect of those getting qualified if the quality of that project is good. That means unless you can make these sustainable development goals very clearly defined and actions, no action can be overall philosophical concept of the meeting the demand of present, simultaneously meeting the preserving for the future generation. But if you can make it subdivided into certain goals, then obviously you can fit it better into one of the sub goals. Anyway, so decent work and economic growth is another, which comes under the so-called socio-economic perspective. It's not, though there are some indirect impact of the technology, but these are mostly related to socio-economic aspect. Then industry, innovation and infrastructure. This has come up to be a very important sustainable development goal, specifically for the young technologists. Because currently, we are giving very much importance on the innovation, both globally, and our national policy has also taken up this particular issue to be very important. The government policy is moving towards not giving more priority to research, but more priority to innovation. There is a little bit difference between innovation and research. Research has a distinct path of making literature review, then identifying the problem, what has not been done, then adding incremental knowledge to this literature review is the research. But innovation can start out of anything. rather improves the existing living standard of the people. So innovations not necessarily it has to start with literature review. So currently, most of the countries, advanced countries, including poor countries, also they have got their very important impact on this particular aspect of the innovation, which not necessarily has to be supported with a lot of funding, the so-called research funding concept, because innovation comes from the real need. So innovative mind can make a solution without going into so-called formal research path, which generally involves longer time period and longer, a larger investment. So combining these ideas, you can find out how the sustainable development contribution come from different aspects. So reduced inequalities, this is also another general statement, and in fact, gender inequality can be a part of that also. So somebody can make a reasoning that why these are, considered to be different if there are certain overlaps. In fact, there is debate is still on in international forum whether the sustainable development goals should be redefined. It may be redefined, but the international community, once they accept something, the change of that is also very difficult. And not difficult in a sense, it things needs time because you have to make a consensus. There should be formal meetings, there should be formal consensus from the diplomatic viewpoint. Also, there should be, formal agreement that we are accepting all. So, but still, the starting point when people accepted these 17 development goals, then obviously these have made a initial impact towards the objective of achieving the sustainability. Goal number 11, sustainable cities and communities. Some people have defined it to be a smart city. The smart city term is very, well known, everybody knows it, but the concept of smart city is having a lot of confusion, I must say, at least in India. Because the smart city concept always makes that particular concept, and smart means what? You have the status update to yourself, you know what are the limitations, and then you take actions accordingly. That's the definition of smart, what is made to be. But the term smart is utilized from that viewpoint if you don't have any resource. For example, in examination, you are not smart by copying, you are smart with your knowledge. And if you know what should be the answer to a question, you can give it very smartly. But if you don't know the subject, how can you make your, smart approach in the examination? Similarly, the question has been raised, if the Indian, specifically villages, even cities, they are not properly designed initially. A lot of traffic, jams and the other pollutions, etc., are inbuilt in the system. Then how can it be smart? So this is a debatable issue. But still, unless you have a defined objective, you cannot improve yourself. So sustainable cities and communities is another debatable area, and that has attracted a lot of debate from different people, or at least in international community. Whenever we meet, still the people go on arguing, regarding whether this should be refined. Goal number 12, responsible consumption and production. This is undoubtedly, you can add up with any of these, but this has to be very much specifically identified as a separate goal, because responsible consumption and production means with specifically with respect to the limited resources. And sometimes it happens that the economic growth has a direct clash with the so-called natural ecosystem. So there the responsible consumption and production issue come into a optimization between the economic growth and the natural ecosystem protection. Climate action, as goal number 13, had to made a very clear statement, because the climate change problem has emerged and accepted in the scientific community that it has to be addressed. Otherwise, the climate action is very, critical from the viewpoint. Unless you make planning earlier and implement those actions, when it will go beyond your control, then you have nothing other than getting destroyed. But in climate action, interesting part is there are debate in international community whether the climate action is proper or not. In a sense, you see, you have a future problem. Scientifically, that is established that the problem is impending. But to what extent the problem will be, that cannot be 100% perfectly predicted. So there are scientific models. Models means always you have an estimation on the basis of scientific estimate, scientific process. And that's why the under the United Nations, all of you might be aware that IPCC, inter international I just forget. Panel of climate change is the last three. Intergovernmental panel of climate change, IPCC. One international body is formed just because there are the representatives are there from selected on a basis from any country that it is open. And generally, all of these committees of IPCC constitute of members from, if not all, with widely varying countries. I mean, African countries, European countries, but obviously numbers cannot be met that absolutely one representation because it depends on the skill achieved also. So the IPCC has got a responsibility of making the estimation of current scenario and on the basis of scientific model to predict what is the expected damage if we move. We call it bow. Bow means business as usual. That means whatever you are doing currently, if you go on doing, how much damage can happen. Then it has got a recommendations of what should be there for better possible option for reducing the so-called damage to some extent. You might have heard about the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. What is that? 1.5 degrees Celsius means you are trying to restrict the average temperature rise of the entire globe, the global average temperature rise less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because you cannot make it zero, because the economic activity has to go on, and then CO2 additions can also be reduced to zero abruptly. You have a long-term plan of reducing. So this way of defining the goal with respect to climate action is interesting part of the global sustainable development goal, which comes under the 13. So any international activity collaboration coming under this climate change aspect, either in modeling or with respect to economic perspective or with respect to scientific mitigation, resilience, these terms you might have heard about these things. That means previously the concept of climate change was how you can mitigate or reduce the climate change effect. Later on, the people have started thinking, no, rather than reducing, some issues can be adapted. So the adaptation came into the picture. And now the concept has come as mitigation, adaptation, then resilience. Resilience means we will act in such a way so that that will become a part of the life. So these are practical aspects. Otherwise, what you can do, you just cannot accommodate within the economic aspect of those actions, because who will pay that money? So obviously, depending on that particular situation, the climate politics, which has been changed the name climate justice later on from these countries like ours, who have claimed it not a climate politics, it's a climate justice. Anyway, so under this Sustainable Development Goal 13, all the climate change actions are coming into, covered. Then 14 goal is life below water. That's very interesting, because you know that the majority of the living creatures are not on the land, but they are under the sea. So obviously, unless you keep watch on those aspects, obviously that's why it has been included as possible sustainable development goal separately, just to preserve our earth. Then life on land is also we cannot ignore. So life below water is one of the goal, life on land is another goal. We have to look at both. Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. These are nothing related to technology, though there will be some indirect impact of technology. Say, currently we know in court, specifically during COVID period, there were the online hearing also happens. Currently also happens it. So that's why this is possible just because of the technological development. But that doesn't mean that the goal of this particular object is related to technology. Having peace, justice, and strong institutions means administrations and governance has to be proper, and these are in addition to the so-called resource utilizations and technological intervention. And last goal number 17 is partnership for the goals. This was considered to be one of the important goals in a sense. When this sustainable development concept was established, then the people were looking for how this path can be adopted. Next, the question came, and question came in that way. Everywhere in the class also, in a group study, if some of the students has got a better understanding of a particular subject aspect, then he or she can share that to his or her friends, and the students can become aware. So when the sustainable development concept was promoted by the United Nations, then there was a proposition that those who cannot adapt to the system faster, they must be helped by those who can adapt to this quite earlier. So what is that? Then the partnership or collaboration came into one of the goals. So out of these 17 goals, interestingly, there you can just go on thinking independently and you can find out there are certain overlaps of these goals too. And if you try to isolate completely, that is completely impossible because one of the goals may have some implications on the other. But why this 17 goals has been defined in United Nations Sustainable Development definition is just to plan actions under these specific goal will make an feasible action plan. Then it may happen that a life on land may have some implications on the life below the water. The ecosystem is such that you cannot separate these two aspects. But if you make some contribution to the life on land, obviously you have to be aware that the life below water is not getting affected simultaneously. So one of the sustainable development goal independently cannot move without the impact on others. So overall, what is the idea of this particular, discussing whatever I am doing in this class? Initially, for the energy conservation, this sustainable development concept was not at all, known because the energy conservation was initially sparked off in 1973 just out of the political reason of Ramadan war. Then the people started thinking later on in different way of the human activities for a better and feasible living standard globally with on equity basis. Then the concept of sustainable development was defined. Then the question was raised, if the sustainable development has to be achieved, what should be the actions? Actions also perfectly cannot be told. If you attend a good presentation on sustainable development, you will find out a lot of debates can always be raised whether this is assured, whether it will also make a sustainable development path. Because like climate change, sustainable development is also one issue which you will act now, you will get the effect later on. That means with respect to future perspective, you are acting currently. And there, nobody can tell with 100% assurance that this will be a sustainable development path action. And this does not affect, in a sense, I mean, if it, whether it will be, it is a, if you don't stick to one particular actions continuously, because always it is accepted that sustainable development goal actions, SDGs, are dynamic. Means whatever action you take, you have to make a review and then switching over to modifying those actions based on whatever is the outcomes. Okay, so I think as I've just, these are, so as to say, the storytelling mode I go on telling for the open elective class just because of making you aware of what you are going to expect if you join in industry. Because in any industry, the sustainable development and sustainable development goals is an integrated part. Any good industry, they have their specific sections for the energy conservation, sustainable development missions, and each of these sections look after the industrial process with the background of making energy conservation has become a law. I mean, you cannot just bypass it. Specifically, those units which consume much of energy. We'll come to that point when the regulations of BE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, will be discussed. Some of the industries, the high energy consuming industries, they are bound to follow the regulations of BE. So it's not the option. But the sustainable development path of the different industries is still an optional, choice. And I know most of the good industries like Reliance, Mahindra, Tata Group, they have their separate unit or office who looks after the sustainable development aspect with respect to industrial progress also. Anyway, so do you think that you need a so-called formal note or this is good enough? You can have the slide and then you can I mean, just discussion is good enough. Okay. Anyway, so let's go to the next part. Now, see, once we have defined the sustainable development goal, then interestingly, the people have started thinking how the sustainable path will be decided. Here, we call that sustainable path has got three distinct pillars. It has to be economic, it has to be environmentally acceptable or benign, and number third is socially acceptable. So the question is, one thing is completely implicit with respect to technologists is that whether the technology development is at all required or not, yes, it's there. Because it is implicitly assumed that unless a system is functional, you cannot judge its economic aspect, you cannot judge its environmental impact, and so within the social, remember, the political systems is also inbuilt because society cannot be without politics. The politics doesn't mean that always it has to be rather it's a bad thing. We have to avoid something like this because we cannot move without politics. You have to have in a democratic country the politics is an inherent integrated part of the total social system. So within the social term, the political aspect is also included. Now think about out of these three different pillars, economic, environmental, and social, how the different options come. When something is socially acceptable and economically feasible, then we call it equitable. Means what? Obviously, if it is economically feasible, means low cost possible option, then it will be acceptable to all because if the it is a high cost system, say renewable energy systems which needs per unit electricity cost to be higher, then it will not be at least economically feasible and acceptable to the poor population. But if it is quite economic, everybody can afford that, then obviously it will be equitable. That means, I mean, possible to adopt both by the poor people and the rich people. And similarly, if it is socially acceptable, then only it will become equitable and accepted to all. One of the example of this, I mean, device is the mobile phone, because the mobile phone cost has and its utility has become so high that the people are trying to adopt the mobile phone. You know the Indian context that the poor people who doesn't have their own toilet, they have their mobile. And interestingly, this has become possible just because the economic affordability of the people is rather the cost of the mobile has become within the economic affordability of the people. So something which is socially acceptable and economically feasible will come under the purview of equitable, but may not be its environmentally feasible. Because all of you know that the waste mobile or rather the expired mobiles cause a lot of environmental problem. So equitable doesn't mean it contribute to the third pillar, environmental. Similarly, if it is environmentally benign and economically feasible, but socially not accepted, this is a viable solution, but actually not a sustainable solution. In a sense, due to some reason, it's not socially accepted. So if I just try to give an example of this, can any of you give an example which is environmentally benign, at least in some way, and economically also feasible, but still not accepted by the society? Any of the options, device, social process, whatever it may be. No response. Okay. One of the, I mean, in fact, that's not a perfect example, but still it is a considered to be one of the very good example for the possible to some extent viable options that has not been accepted though is the nuclear power, because the nuclear power sometimes was considered to be the best possible option for large scale power generation during the transition from fossil fuel based energy system to completely renewable system, because nuclear power, has got significant capacity They can generate of the order of several thousand megawatts without any almost no environmental impact during operation. But what was the social perception or threat perception is that if anything happens, I mean, some functional defects or rather some destruction of those nuclear power plants due to some reasons, even it can happen due to war, then obviously the damage will be enormous. So what happened? I myself know when in 2005 the Sweden was 50% nuclear and 50% hydro. This is the country energy electricity supply structure. But that time they have started switching over to shut down of the nuclear power plants. It's a social mandate. And I know that at least at that time, they have shut down several nuclear power plants as their electricity source. And they are switching over to gas turbine based plant, considering that even the gas turbine based plant, though there are certain environmental impact, it's a better option rather than the future possible dangerous possibility of the nuclear power plants. Even in Europe, except France, none of the countries are adding up the nuclear power plants as far as I know. But someday it can switch over to other policies. So viable options means it may be acceptable, but it is not getting accepted due to the social constraint or not being socially accepted. Another example of this viable options is say Tata Nano car, and that was considered to be a economic and simultaneously giving better mileage means environmentally better solution because of fuel consumption for per kilometer mobility was less. But interestingly, people didn't accept the nano car due to some social stigma sort of thing, though it was considered initially to be a very good options for the middle class and lower middle class people to afford their own car. So it didn't happen just due to social non-acceptance. Interestingly, these viable solutions are those that could have been a path that's not accepted, but that's possible. Similarly, environmentally benign and socially acceptable are the livable options, which is not economic. In fact, the most important or relevant example of this kind of livable options are renewable energy, which was earlier considered to be. Now, the renewable energy costing with respect to technology development, all renewable energy costings are decreasing, not in the same rate. Like Germany, I know because we had some projects on that. Actually, they had substantial government subsidy for switching over to solar power from there. Germany is also a country who have a lot of coal-based electricity production. So they had the program of initially with 20,000 roof program. That's the name they have given. That means they initially targeted with 20,000 house roof to be covered with solar panels. It's quite earlier, 10 years earlier. And then they have 200,000, they have made that extended. And that time, interestingly, government gave a lot of funding towards the renewable, specifically solar power, because the per unit costing of production of electricity from the solar panels was much higher than the so-called coal-based system. So it was not economic, but it was livable. Means environment and the people also accepted that because government subsidy, always remember, doesn't mean that it is being paid by government out of nothing. It is being paid by the tax of the people. That means government decision is getting reflected when social consensus is theoretically accepted. If some government doesn't do that, that's their responsibility. But interesting part is when government does something, we can accept that. We have to accept in a democratic structure that that's the majority consensus opinion, and that's why it's a government policy. But that doesn't happen everywhere. But we have to accept there is no other option than the democracy in the system. So you can now understand what is livable option. Livable options means environmentally benign, socially acceptable, but may not be economically feasible. And interestingly, out of these intersections, livable, viable, and equitable, if all these are again simultaneously satisfied, then what you get is sustainable. This is again a theoretical definition, and you can find out that from this definition, the sustainable development options or actions that can lead to sustainable development can be at least step by step coming closer to the path of sustainable actions. not necessarily also the interpretations all will be very right in the process of making decision, but still you have to have a framework of guiding you towards the sustainable option, and that is through these three pillar testing: social, environmental, and economic. And then at least two intersections of these two makes a possible option closer to the sustainability but not necessarily sustainable. But if these three options are simultaneously satisfied, then only you get a sustainable path as per definitions of the sustainable development. But I give a caution to all of you, this is not that so straightforward and easy. If you come into the research field of sustainable development, you will find out you cannot work on only on technological aspect. You have to look into these three issues, and they're currently different indexing. That means parameters are evolving. Like in your technology development, always there is a parameter which is called efficiency. Efficiency means desired output by required input. Here, the terms are yet to be defined completely. We have in our some of our publications has made some new terminology, because new terminology options are still there in sustainability, where the sustainability index are defined from different perspectives. Say some of the index is taking care of the environmental issue, some of the environment is taking of combinations of environment and social. That's been livable index. Maybe some of the criteria is consisting of two, and then overall sustainability has to be assessed with respect to multi-criteria optimization, giving some weightage factor. So theoretical studies and research publications are quite, good option in this type of actions that can be taken for the sustainable development path. Any queries up to this? Okay. If not, then I can proceed. I don't think these need some dictation, because these things are easily available in internet searching also. But the concept of these figures has to be understood. So whatever the question that can come into the examination, once you understand this overlap principles of three basic goals of the sustainability, the social, environmental, and economic, then you can answer those. So I'm not going into any text definition for this part. Then came the climate change actions. What happened in climate change actions is, once the climate change has been identified by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in fact, what happened, scientific facts originates mostly from the published papers in open literature. The There is a threat of climate change due to the greenhouse gas addition that has been published long back, but generally people doesn't pay much heed, rather than giving it an importance of one of the publications, nothing else. But over the period, as many people find out that this is really a threatening issue, then the overall administration and governance start moving in that direction. These things happened in the pollution scenario also. When initially, if you just look about the pollution issues, those pollution and the research, open literature research publications on the area of pollutions on specific areas, it can be due to the air pollution, due to the water pollution. So several journal publications has been made long back, but administration was not. This is the academic publication. Okay, good. There are certain, when the pollution is happening, we should not give that much importance on that. That may be the outlook of the government and the administration. But later on, what happens as it goes on highlighting the real problems of those issues, then the administration and the government has to accept it. Initially at the local level, later on at global level, it can happen. This is the top-down, bottom-up approach. That means from the individual government's demand, it has come into the United Nations demand, but it can happen as a bottom-up, top-down approach also. That means global level, it is defined, and then it has come down to the people. In fact, climate change is a action plan. Its action plan has been taken at the top-down approach, because once the publications in the scientific world has increased so much with possible threats of specifically the sea level rise and the associated atmospheric disturbance and creating the cyclones and other
natural calamities, then at least international communities of the leading countries have realized we cannot ignore it. And in fact, at country level, action plans were not done that much unless the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we call it even FCCC, in 1994, initiated that particular aspect of it needs global intervention because the associated problem may have a global impact. It cannot be solved by any country. For example, the CO2 addition being added from India can cause severe havoc in US also. So interestingly, we call it climate change. The source is local, effect is global. So obviously, unless you take the actions or rather the overall policy planning at the global level and define who should do what at the local level, then it may not be that much effective. So the climate change actions were basically the top-down approach, not the bottom-up one. So under the United Nations framework of climate change, even FCC definitions of 1994, when it was accepted as an international, future possible calamity aspect, then the people were very much concerned at the international level or global level to take actions. People know the name more about the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which happened in Kyoto, where the, many of the advanced countries and some of the developing countries joined together to address this climate change, not to find out scientific facts, but to take the actions based on scientific facts. Because scientific facts, what is happening, and then what can happen in future, and what should be the actions, that will be decided by the people from the basis of the scientific knowledge. But a very important aspect involved with the climate change is the economic aspect. Because unless you have sufficient money to take actions to mitigate or to adapt these systems, you cannot just challenge that climate change problem. So, who will bear that money? Because the question comes up, who has caused the climate change? Always we take in that way in our general social life. If you are responsible for some nuisance, you have to pay for that. So, who have caused this nuisance are the mostly developed countries because their CO2 emission to the atmosphere was much, much higher than those underdeveloped countries. But due to that CO2 emission, not necessarily most affected will be those people, but some other part of the world, some very poor people who have almost contributed no CO2, they will be affected. One of the classical example globally is given due to the climate change problem, our Sundarban area may be lost someday because if sea level rise very small amount, then all the Sundarban islands will be below the water. So a lot of populations in the Sundarban area will lose their completely livelihood. Either they have to be shifted or those entire place will go below the water. So that's why, but that they are not responsible for this particular problem of losing their livelihood and their place of residence. Just one. হ্যাঁ শান্ত তুমি পাঠিয়েছো আমি একটু আমি ক্লাসে আছি আমি তোমাকে দেখে নিয়ে পরে কথা বলছি ঠিক আছে so that's why this responsibility of to be responsible who have caused this problem, they have to take up the responsibility. This concept is also inbuilt in this climate change problem. So what is the issue is there we have to take that financial liability distribution also accordingly, and that's the name came climate justice. And in fact, the changing the name climate politics to climate justice, one of the leading countries is India. India has promoted that particular idea that it should not be a politics defined, it should be a defined justice, because we are being the subject to the problem of climate change just because of the developed countries has emitted more carbon dioxide in past. Anyway, so through these different protocols, Kyoto Protocol was basically in 1997 when a lot of countries, they accepted to stick to the measures of reducing the climate change action, the climate change problem. Then the Bali roadmap in 2007, later on, Cancun agreements, all these are the incremental improvement and adding up more countries committed to the climate change actions. So United Nations Climate Change Conference in Durban. So these are the names I've just given, some of the few, and you can have all these things. And later on, in 2021, COP26, it happened in the in Glasgow, UK, where the last adopted action plans with respect to current scenario, because always the situation is changing. In climate change, the problem is that, say, there was a 10 years back, there was a prediction of the IPCC, this is going to happen if these things are continued. Then the IPCC has another recommendation. If these actions are taken, then it can be reduced to such and such. So there was a modeling and prediction. Next, the international community in these forum, they have made some global plan, and accordingly the national plans are decided. Then after 10 years, again make a review whether the prediction is matching or there is certain deviations from the prediction. Obviously, there will be deviations, not because the model is never perfect, but also actions has been taken also, and these actions are not also perfect. Because always think that when you come to the theoretical world in the classroom sort of thing, we can make a lot of good modeling publications, etc. But at international level, action planning and the actual implementation can never match. This is reality. This is we sometimes go on criticizing the politics only. Politics is not only responsible for this particular thing. There are in a human society, there is wide variations, and this is quite expected. Don't expect that everybody will become very much disciplined as desired. There will be certain gap at different locations, but still we have to always target towards making these systems towards a common goal. With this, always the dynamic action plans in climate change actions has to be made. So that's why it is called a complex problem of future unseen danger, because you don't want to see that danger. That's why you are taking plans. So it's future unseen danger versus collective planning, actions and loss, investment of large economic resources. Because the climate change mitigation problem, say if all the countries have collectively accepted that rather than sticking to the current fossil fuel based systems, which has to be changed in future, because you cannot stick to the fossil fuel based systems, because the fossil fuel will be depleted after some years, maybe some in 30 years, some in 200 years. But still, you have to have a action plan, means that needs some economic investment also. So who will make this economic investment? We cannot put it on a country who is very poor, but the rich countries also cannot bear those entire liability of those countries also. So continuous negotiation process goes on happening in the climate change action plans. And in fact, I had a rather excellent presentation in the Netherlands, where we have found out that globally the northern countries are generally developed countries, southern part of the globe are generally, I'm not telling underdeveloped, but economically less capacity, except Australia and New Zealand. So what is happening, she was a lady actually, she explained it in a very excellent way, how the climate change politics has divided this globe at the northern part of the globe and the southern part of the globe. Because the actions plans has been in the northern plan and with the interest of the northern part of the globe countries, and rather the southern part of the globe has been has been affected due to this climate change, and they are sometimes being deprived. And this is a part of the politics, international global politics. It will always happen, because those who have more power, more capacity, more money, they will not spare things unless they have some feeling of developing as a whole, number one. Some countries are still there like that, and unless they are compelled. Now the community realizes that climate change is such a problem which cannot be, the entire burden cannot be pushed over those poor countries, because they will also suffer. If the strong natural calamities like hurricanes, cyclones, etc. happen, the countries like US will also not be spared, and not being spared because US is those prone areas. So obviously, unless the climate change problem is resolved, then they will also suffer a lot. So this has made some sort of under compulsion unity is there. So it's maybe a boon in disguise sort of thing. but still the challenge is very big. Any question or confusion up to this? No. So class has got less response, I find. Anyway, later on I may have some response, because these are just like storytelling mode, but later on the subject technical content will also come. Now I'm going into the natural resources and its efficient use. This is considered to be one of the most important issue of the so-called sustainable development path, because you have a natural resource. Natural resource means this is not owned by anyone, but indiscriminate use of those natural resources can cause problem to others. For example, all of you know that because the standard practice previously, for example, some 30 years back, I must say 30 years, standard practice in India was just all the industrial waste was being discharged to the river Ganges. And you know that the on the both sides of the river Ganges, Ganga Nadi Erki, so there are a lot of industrial developments are there. And those chemically toxic materials were simply being discharged to Ganges just because this is the easiest, no cost option possible. But current, and that's what has happened. The entire the river ecosystem has been affected from the aquatic life, and then government has realized that it's not cannot be allowed, and now the rules and regulations are so much stringent over the different regimes of the government. There are different names has been taken, Ganga Action Plan, and now it has been renamed as Namami Gange. Anyway, these are the political names, but action plan is very clear. Our longest river, in a sense, not only the longest, but also in a sense of most important river in India is no doubt the Ganges, and we have to protect it for the future interest. So there are the action plans where even the industries cannot discharge their liquids to the river Ganges without any pre-treatment or making it to be the acceptable certain level or certain percentage of those toxic materials. Maximum percentage of toxic material has to be taken care of. And as far as I know from my working with different industries, the government is making future very much stringent action plan. That means they call it zero discharge actions. And the zero discharge means whatever discharge you put into the rivers, those must be, almost no toxicity to the river. And this, what will the effect then? The product cost will, in that process, will increase. Because if you have to make a post-operation, the basic process, say a tannery, which processes the, so-called animal skin to produce those their product. Now, what has happened in tannery process? The skin, animal skin, has to be processed with different chemicals, and finally, the chemical and the wastewater. After the processing, you cannot reuse it. If you want to reuse, you can reuse. You need some subsequent chemical processing again after the process. So, if you do not do that, it was rather economically better profitable if you can discharge that toxic, ultimate discharge to the river. And that was actually adopted in Kanpur area. A lot of tanneries did that, and one of the major source of pollution was that. And in many of the major cities, even in Kolkata, our sewerage system goes to the river. But in sewerage system, there are the issues are related to not the toxic material as a whole, because these are domestic waste material and industrial waste material has got two different characteristics. Domestic waste material has got undoubtedly something that cannot be reconsumed by the human being, but they are not that much toxic. Some of those so-called addition of impurities may be good for the aquatic life of that of the river. Okay, so but the chemically toxic material may be very much harmful for this aquatic life. Anyway, so based on these, actually, the action plans are also goes on changing, and the natural resources and its efficient use has become one of the important aspect for the sustainable development path. Now let's see The global primary energy, three important resources on the basis of fossil fuel based systems. What we are going to do? The largest fossil fuel reserve as a single one, a single type, is the solid fuel coal. And what happens in coal is it's most abundantly available primary energy resource, no doubt about it. Available in almost all countries doesn't mean all countries. Many of the countries has got that coal reserves, whatever small, whatever large. And undoubtedly our country is a very good positions with respect to coal. Most probably previously it was fourth, but now it's most probably fifth largest reserve in with respect to global context. In our coal has got certain problems. We will come to that later on. We have large ash content, but we have very low sulfur content. That means with respect to emission or rather air pollution, Indian coal is good because sulfur oxides are not there. But with respect to solid waste deposit, especially if any one of you have your house somewhere around those power plants, say Kolaghat, Bandel, etc., you might have a feeling that all the roofs are covered with some ash, if not that ash handling plan is properly made. Now, a lot of new devices has come up in power plant where the smallest ash particles are also being arrested, but still some leakage is there. Earlier it was much more, but government regulations has also become stringent, and now the emissions of those ash particles are getting reduced. Anyway, so the coal being a largest fossil fuel based resource, and automatically that reflection has happened in the electricity production. Till date, majority of the electricity production as a single largest fossil fuel, coal has its most important dominance because maximum part of the electricity production as a single fossil fuel is from coal. Then the distributions of coal in almost about some 75 countries in recoverable form. What do you mean by recoverable form is very clear. Even in some countries, coal is there at such a depth that may not be economically feasible to go to that depth and extract it. And interestingly, some of cases, extraction of coal can lead to environmental damage. And that has happened severely in our country. I know that in some of the national level committee meeting that the Coal India, has got severe clash, or rather the Coal Ministry, better to say, has got severe difference of opinion with respect to the Ministry of Environment and Forest, because many of the coal reserves in India has been found out which is under the deep forest zone. Now what will happen? If you want to extract that coal affecting that forest, so what will happen? This will jeopardize the socio-economic life of that particular forest. So obviously there is a constraint that getting coal and affecting the environment, this has become contradictory. And interestingly, these challenging themes are coming more and more because previously environment was giving least concern, but now environment is coming at topmost concern, just reverse. So obviously your natural resources always may not be extractable form. So what is given is that in recoverable form is in 75 countries, but it doesn't mean that in the rest of the other countries there is not. Coal reserves are not there, but that may not be recoverable. Coal has to be at such a level, such a depth, so that it can be extracted from the ground, and then you can utilize it. In fact, coal mines can be of two types. It can be open cast mining. That means you simply remove the top portions of the crust of the earth, and then you extract the coal directly. And these are easy to extract. And in fact, in Dhanbad, Jharia, those places, many open cast minings are there. But some of the coals are at such a depth that you cannot remove the complete complete crust above the coal level. So you have to make a tunnel. And these are a little bit risky in extraction process because sometimes the groundwater gets into those, and many accidents has happened. One of the accidents maybe before the birth of before the birth of many of you. I don't remember the year, at 70s some period, Chashnala, where that more than 250 laborers actually died just due to the water leakage inside that particular mine. Anyway, so, but the overall scenario for the coal is and the production process of coal is at high pressure and temperature from trees and other things that get submerged within due to some natural calamity, etc. Then with high pressure temperature over a long period, this gets converted into coal. An interesting part of this coal is it takes some several thousand years to form, but it consumption, if it is fast, then obviously you cannot reproduce coal by the same process. Only nature can do that, and nature did it over a long period. Now, what is the problem is you have a limited resource, because coal production does not mean you are generating coal. Coal production means nothing other than extractions of the limited resource. So obviously, geological formation process and utilizations, the time frame is so varying. That means formation of coals took some large number of years, but consumption of coals takes only some 100 years. So obviously, the resource depletion is an important issue. Depending on the maturity over time, means how many years the coal was under the ground. Based on that, different quality of coals are formed. This may be the lowest category, maybe peat, means just these has got more the so-called raw material flavor or characteristics of those trees, etc. But partially converted to that particular coal formation. Lignite is the next stage, and then peat and lignite, they are not considered as coal, but they are the earlier stages of coal. Then the coal formation, even in the coal, there are certain characteristics like the highest quality coal. The highest quality coal is determined on the basis of what is the calorific value and what is the amount of ash present in those. Because ash present means it's the non-combustible part. So lesser ash means what? With per kg of coal, you have more calorific value, because ash doesn't contribute to the calorific value. So based on that, the anthracite coal is considered to be the highest quality. Lesser, earlier than bituminous is also quite accepted, and sub-bituminous is, most of the Indian coals come under the category of sub-bituminous and bituminous. And anthracite coals has to be imported from other places. Anyway, so those things I will come when I'll just discuss those issues later on. Then according to the reserve, USA number 1, Russia number 2, China 3, Australia has come up as the 4th country. But earlier, because why this number change? You can just apply your general, apply your common sense. Then you can realize why these things change, because we are continuously exploring the natural resources. So the coal reserves, oil reserves, gas reserves, these are continuously being explored. Like in India, the new coal mines are continuously being explored by the Coal India. Similarly, oil and natural gas is being explored by the company ONGC. Okay, so they are finding new reserves. So in every country there are certain, because these things are not, easily visible. There are some certain scientific methods. You can go on exploring these things, and sometimes in India is still looking for, if they can find out a very large oil reserve, many of the socio-political economic problems will be solved. And unfortunately, though ONGC has explored very exhaustively, the resource is not found except the 2 places. One is the western part, Bombay High, and then another is the northeast Assam area. So that's why the oil is a severe problem, and Government of India is now forced to switch over from oil-based transportation to the electricity or e-mobility. Anyway, so why I'm just mentioning this, India has become 5, because when I started teaching this course, it was India in the position of 4, but now Australia has come up because they have got much more reserves in between these period. So anyway, being in 5th in the globally, it's a good position with respect to energy security associated with coal. So the coal-based power plant will continue for a longer period in India, but always remember there is a pressure from the international community to reduce coal-based electricity production due to the climate change, because you have your resource in the form of coal, but you are contributing carbon dioxide, which is affecting the global population. So, and there is how you can make your, politics to in favor of you. That's the responsibility of the so-called diplomacy of the country. And India has taken a stand that they will reduce their coal-based electricity production over a targeted, period of its, a future projection. But simultaneously, it is not possible that India will reduce their coal-based power production to zero. Both India and China, they are producing CO2 emission. Rather, they are causing the CO2 emission from their coal-based power plant to substantial extent. USA is also responsible. But India and China never entered into very severe commitment with respect to reduction of coal use from the real practical aspect, because it's not possible to maintain our economic growth and then simultaneously drastically reducing coal-based power. There is a always certain pressure from the international community of making this lesser coal use, but India will have to do. Then according to reserve by production ratio, this is called R by P. This is a very important ratio, because in any country, there is reserve means whatever you have estimated or established reserve within your country, and production means how much you are extracting from the mines. So according to R by P ratio, the coal will last to over 100 years globally. So with respect to fossil fuels, at least we are safe regarding the coal part. 100 years is still assumed if you can go on with respect to resource, but not with respect to climate change. Maybe if we just go on using coal at the same rate for 100 years to exhaust it, by that time climate change will ruin us. So there is another optimization we have to make. Currently contributes to maximum electricity production by coal and other non-energy uses, because coal has got certain non-energy uses too, still. The metallurgy students, they know it very well, because the extraction of metals from the ore of different metals, it needs significant heating, and sometimes the so-called reduction process needs the coal entering into chemical reaction with the ore, and for that purpose we call it non-energy use. These are not used for energy productions, or rather the electricity production. They are used for non-energy use, and some of the coals are also used for fertilizer production also. So based on this, the coal consumption depends on non-energy sectors also. There is some fraction or some part of the coal utilization is in the energy, but majority is used for the power production. Also contributes to maximum CO2 addition as a single fuel. So the plus point is it gives better energy security, and the minus point is it has got the maximum amount of CO2 emission as a single fossil fuel source. So as the time is over, I will have a roll call, and then next day I will discuss about the other two fossil fuels, that means oil and natural gas. What is the scenario with respect to global picture? Any queries up to this, if somebody has any queries? Some of the classes response is rather poor. Anyway, Sheikh Muhammad Ali, I will take the attendance from today only, because I decided not to go for the last 2 days. It doesn't matter anyway. So Sheikh Muhammad Ali, no. Let me stop presenting so that I can see people. Okay. Then Dityendu Gupta.
Present, sir.
Okay. Then Shaunak Agarwal.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Anubhav Shah.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Gitan Dash. Gitan Dash, absent. Vaibhav Agarwal, absent. Then Pial Bishas, absent. Sangjukta Mandal,
Present, sir.
good. Then Debargho Chakraborty,
Present, sir.
good. Aditya Agarwal,
Present, sir.
good. Then Aditya Chakraborty,
Present, sir.
good. Then Aniket Sardar,
Present, sir.
good. Then Rupayan Pal, Rupayan, No, he's not there. Then Shubham Dash.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Ovirup Mandal.
Present, sir.
Good. Sanskriti Tamang Singh. Sanskriti, are you here? No. Then Riddhiman Barua. Riddhiman, not there. Then Oyonavo Maiti.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Rupam Chakraborty. Rupam absent. Then Shayan Bishas.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Jeet Das.
স্যার প্রেজেন্ট স্যার রূপম চক্রবর্তী প্রেজেন্ট।
তুমি ছিলে না, দৌড়ে এসছো কোনো জায়গা থেকে?
না না স্যার এক্ষুনি ছিলাম স্যার, আমি আমার এখানে একটা
বাবা এগুলো করো না, ক্লাসের ডিস্টারবেন্স হয়, ক্লাসে একটু অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স দেওয়ার সময় থেকো।
না না স্যার সাইডে একটা পলিটিক্স এর ওই অ্যানাউন্স হচ্ছে স্যার, ওই জন্য শুনতে পাইনি সত্যি স্যার।
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, কিছু বলো। জিৎ দাস। জিৎ দাস অ্যাবসেন্ট। তারপরে হচ্ছে কৌশিক মাঝি। কৌশিক মাঝি absent. So I guess that chemical engineering third year students are all covered. Nobody left. I'm really thankful to most probably Vishwajit something his name. He has made it for me. I'm really thankful. Then I'm starting with the construction. Construction is only one student. Mohan Kumar Agarwal. Mohan Kumar Agarwal is absent.
Yes, sir. Present, sir.
You are there. Okay, fine, good. Then Devorpita Maji.
Sir, present.
Present. Okay, fine. Then Shanu De, food technology.
Present, sir.
Good. Then we are starting with instrumentation. Acha. Shupradip Bhuiya. Na Shupradip Bhuiya. Shupradip. No. Then Orchit Raj Lal. No. Then Shashank Misro. Shashank Misro. No. So none of the instrumentation students are here. Anyway, then we have the metallurgical engineering students. Abdul Wahid, not here. Then Shorin Khan.
Present, sir.
Shorin is present. Okay, fine. Then Shostik Ghatak.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Shupriya Sharma.
Yes, sir.
Okay, you are present. Fine, good. Then Shomik Mandal. Shomik Mandal, no. Then Joydeep Sarkar.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Niloy Shaha. Niloy Shaha, absent. Then Joy Mullik.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Sheikh Abu Raihan.
Present, sir. Present, sir.
Good. Accepted. Jeet Dash, metallurgy.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Somnath Mandal.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Shubhajit Patro.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Rana Chandra Das. Absent. Then I'm coming to power engineering. Shalil Kishku.
Present, sir.
Good. Then Choitali Majumdar. Choitali absent.